This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are talking about fatal flaws, the tragic fault in our characters that will ruin them if they don't resolve them over the course of the character arc. So, would either of you like to start us off with a question or a thought to launch this roundtable?
Yeah, I think there's for me there's a question about believability with these. It's a really fine line to tread, where for me it often happens when I'm watching a movie and you think, no, that's just stupid. Why are you doing that? We were watching something last night. I think it was The Girl with All the Gifts. And which is a great, fabulous book. Love the book, but I must have watched about 10 minutes of the movie, and no, that's it. I'm not doing that. There's one part. It's not the main character, but it's one of the sort of sub characters. So you kind of know that he's going to get killed off anyway. But they just keep making these decisions and then keep making them. Oh, look, come on, yeah, okay, I know you're hungry, but you know that you're just going into the lair there, and all the kids are going to. The zombie kids are going to line up and eat you, and it just seemed like it was too ridiculously, unbelievable. Now, so if you translate that into a main character where there's a fatal flaw that just keeps dragging them into things for the sake of the plot, that's the thing I struggle with. So how do you make a fatal flaw believable? I guess is what the question is.
Okay. Interesting. So the fatal flaw is the deep psychological wound that the character may or may not even be able to describe or name this fatal flaw. It could take years of therapy before the character realizes what this fatal flaw is. But as writers, we need to have a sense of this flaw. It's like the deepest motivating factor on our motivation cake, and those can often be related. So the fatal flaw is not the thing we see in the actions. Those are like symptoms of the fatal flaw.
Yeah, the expression of it, yeah.
Yeah, expressions of it. So, like if the character has a drinking problem, that's not the fatal flaw. That's a symptom of the fatal flaw. So what causes the character to drink? Well, the character's parents were terrible, right? Well, that's also not the fatal flaw. That might be one of the causes of the fatal flaw or related to the fatal flaw. But keep going deep into your character's psyche. The character has no self-worth and believes that nothing he does will ever measure up. That might be the fatal flaw. So we're looking for how does this express itself in the story? And if you haven't identified that true fatal flaw, you might make choices that are convenient for your plot, like you were describing, Robert, but that end up feeling kind of fluffy, kind of Deus Ex Machina, like we just don't believe it. It doesn't feel integral to the character because we aren't seeing those choices as expressions of something deeper. We're seeing them as some expressions of something convenient to the writer.
Right, yeah. So when a fatal flaw is well written, then we experience the external action on the page, or not necessarily action, bang it up sense action, but the activity, the character's activity on the page, we experience that as something quite believable because it fits within their personality. Even if we, the reader, don't know what that fatal flaw is, the author has got some understanding of what's driving the character.
Right. Yeah.
And so
exactly.
it's threaded through from the very first sentence, really. Ideally, I guess.
Yeah, it is, and it's something that should resolve itself by the end of the book or the series, if it's a series. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you put a pink bow on it and, the character's done a 180, but you have dealt with it. So it's gone through the arc and it's come to fruition, whether that's tragic or, happily ever after or somewhere in between. Buffy the Vampire Slayer has a really nice neat, tragic flaw because we see it throughout her progression as a character. She thinks that she has to be a solo, in charge, bear the weight of the world, quite literally on her shoulders. Nobody can help her because they'll be in danger if they do help her. And this gets her in trouble over and over again. And she does, learn to let the Scoobies in and have people help her and rely on Giles. And then she even dies and there's a new Slayer in town. So then she's got a collaborator with superpowers. So we see this keep playing out in more nuanced ways, and she evolves with it. So that flaw becomes less pressing and more subtle as her relationships evolve and she grows, And when the series ended after 7 years, she conceived of a way to have all of the potential Slayers become real Slayers. So it is the ultimate sharing of responsibility, the ultimate sharing of the weight of the world, because no longer does she have to worry about and protect her friends who are mortals, although some are witches and, werewolves and whatever, but she's got a team of Slayers, right? So we go from the chosen one standing alone, can't even conceive of sharing the power for fear of people getting hurt, to hundreds of Slayers, right? So that arc is very apparent there. And there are lots of ways to play with the flaw and shift it. So it isn't going to look like one thing over and over and over in your book.
Yeah, so that brings to mind that whole Fritz Perls thing, that which is most undone is what drives us. So I suppose you could have an apparent even fix of the fatal flaw, but it's actually just pushed somewhere else. And that wound is still driving the character, like all of us in real life, really.
Right.
So, because I was thinking, if you seal it up in a series, then is it then hard to bring that character back into something else? Well, I suppose if you're a clever writer, you find another way to show that there was still a crack.
Right.
And from what you're saying, it sounds as if a well-written or well-rounded main character is probably going to have their fatal flaw quite well connected to their arc in either the book or the series.
Yes, absolutely. It has to be connected to the character's arc. It is the thing the character needs to resolve over the course of the arc. It's the primary change that we're striving toward through the character's arc. So we've talked about Harry Potter multiple times on the show. He's the boy without a family, specifically a father. In that epilogue at the very end of the series, he is a father, right? That has been resolved over the series arc. And along the way, he's had lots of opportunities and in different ways has formed new family units, from his best friends to the Weasley family to Sirius Black as a father figure, and they all get taken away. Buffy's got the secret identity her mom can't know about, then her mom knows, and she's got some support from her mom, then her mom is dead, right? So there's this constant give and take and evolution as the character tries to resolve this flaw that is motivating so many choices, like secrecy versus sharing, bearing the weight of the world, keeping people safe, allowing people to help and support you. So,
right. We want that flaw to be exacerbated by the plot, or so that the conflict there is that they have to battle with themselves as well as the external forces.
Right. And the issues that come up in the plot, the stakes and the tension, will reinforce the character's struggle with that fatal flaw. It's safe to share my responsibility. Oh, no, it's not. Mom just died, Willow turned black, whatever happened. So there's that push and pull through the character's arc. as, you think of the way we go through life and we learn things and it's a spiral. It's not really a straight line. You don't just go, oh yeah, I got that lesson. Life is better now. Things go up and down and we keep coming back around to the same lessons until, if we're lucky, we got it and get to move on to a new lesson. Mm-hmm. So your character's fatal flaw, don't see it as a static thing.
Right.
Right. It's going to be one thing at its heart, but there are lots of ways for that to play out in the world of your story, and lots of ways for your character to engage with that flaw through the plot and maybe come very close to resolving it or looking like it's resolved, and then it gets pulled away again.
Okay, so my question before then about how do we make it sort of seem real, the issue for the author then is being too heavy-handed with it and almost writing it, almost having the character express it as if they know it.
Right.
So we should always try and keep it hidden from our main character, in the sense that it's their blind spot. And if you can think about it like that, as when you're writing your main character, that's probably going to be more helpful than having the character saying, well, Ken, because I never had a family, it makes me really desperate for company.
Yeah.
And that's why I seek out all these bad girls. So it just, no. You got to show it through action and not have the protagonist or the antagonist, for that matter, I guess, realize it.
Yeah, I like that idea of making it the character's blind spot, something, you might understand an event from your past, it happened, you might understand somebody hurt you, but we don't keep our finger on everything that's driving our choices through life, especially in emotional moments. So, Buffy could understand she's the chosen one, singular, but when it comes to letting people help her, she gets panicky and she pushes them away. So that's not a rational, calm response, right? Mm-hmm. So there are things we understand, but that core wound is usually deeply subconscious.
Right, so it's that irrationality that's got to make sense to the reader or the viewer. Mm-hmm. It's when the irrationality doesn't make sense when you read it. You go, well, why did they do that?
Right.
And maybe the author knows. The author they've done this because back when they were 12, they were bullied at school. But it doesn't make sense to us because we haven't felt that come through.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, and to stick with Buffy here. The parents got divorced and Buffy and her mom moved to Sunnydale. So maybe the writer, Joss Whedon, just wanted the father off the screen so that he had one less character to write who was integral to Buffy's life. It could have been that practical. But if we're thinking about wounds and the subconscious mind, she could be thinking, I was a bad girl, so daddy left. It's that kind of... subconscious reaction, even though rationally, logically, we understand that's not why relationships fall apart. Kids, even teenage kids, can feel that. And so that feeds into this idea of I can't let people get too close, or I can't put anyone in danger, or I can't rely on anyone because they'll go away. So that's a piece of her backstory, but he shows it to the audience. It's right there at the beginning of the series. So we understand right away she's coming from a broken home. She's starting over in a new school. That makes her a little bit fragile going into this chosen one thing. Mm-hmm.
Right. And we're seeing the symptoms of the underlying wound. And I think for a lot of that believability, if your symptoms make sense or if your character's addressing symptoms that make sense, then, as readers or as an author, we can trace it back. They may just see the symptom and be like you said, blindsided by the deeper emotional range of it. But she does have surface level symptoms that will come up over and over and over again that she can acknowledge or say. Like, I'm not as familiar with Buffy, but like with Harry Potter, when he sees his parents in the mirror, that's a symptom that is very, I mean, he understands why he's going back and visiting. And we understand why he's going back and visiting. And we also understand that there's a deeper level to it than just that he wants to sit there and see visually his parents. So.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a great way that Rowling got at that wound and that flaw, that deep psychological need of Harry's without telling us about it. You know, so whether you use a magic mirror or dreams or, you know, whatever the thing is that's haunting your character, that's one way to try to reveal the subconscious motivators to your readers.
So why is it called the fatal flaw?
Yes, good. That was going to be my question.
Because flaws are things your characters do that affect your plot arc. So they're like those surface things and those symptom things, like having a short temper, drinking too much, being a workaholic, whatever. They're like character traits, but to the negative side, and they affect your plot. The fatal flaw is that thing that has to be resolved in the character's arc for the story to make sense. You know, it's that driver that carries us through the story. So the fatal flaw is related to motivation. And they might be the same thing or two sides of the same coin. You know, so like Harry Potter's need for family, that's his deepest wound. We can call it his fatal flaw. It's also his driving force, you know, whereas Buffy's flaw is the need to be solo, carry the weight of the world, and push people away. And that doesn't make her want to be the Slayer, but it drives how she approaches that work of being the Slayer.
Okay.
Right. So these things play out in our characters' choices, the actions and reactions as we go through the plot.
So is it fatal because it's something that could lead them to make a choice they're unaware of the consequences of? And therefore that could be put them in a life or death scenario.
Yeah, and it's the thing that, you know, psychologically speaking, could lead to their demise if they don't resolve it, if they don't find a way to come to terms with it or to change. So, you know, Buffy resolved it. She shared the power with all of the potential Slayers, with hundreds of other young women. Right. Harry defeated Voldemort and became a father and a provider. So
they could end up, if it doesn't play out or it continually recurs, then they could end up being psychically broken. So that whole sort of Jungian thing of the dark side, or even, you know, turn them into an antagonist, I guess, you know, is that's where we could see the fatal flaw played out, where it becomes destructive.
Right. I
suppose the reference here also would be, there's that great resource that Becca and Angela put together, the emotional wounds thesaurus.
Yeah,
that'd be a good place to start for prompts on this sort of thing if anyone listening is keen to explore it further.
We can link to the episode we did with Becca Puglisi.
Yeah, sure. So if we're talking about like the fatal flaw, right, and the examples that we brought are kind of like they only have this one flaw and then you resolve it at the end. But what do you do if like you have, I mean, we don't all just have one massive flaw, right? We're kind of like constantly dealing with different things that are popping up. Like you can't just resolve. I know, right? Like you can't resolve your whole life by the time that you figure out your one big major wound. So how do you handle that? Or like, can you?
Well, for the sake of story, let's assume, you know, within the bounds of a novel, our character has one fatal flaw. But then that fatal flaw can have many symptoms. So it can manifest as multiple flaws that can evolve and change. But at the core, there's that one issue. Like, being unloved, hurting the people you love or thinking you do, feeling unworthy, unlucky, abandoned, those types of things lead to the fatal flaw. So maybe it's feeling like you need to be responsible for saving the world, but not in the Buffy sense. In the character book, I use the example of a lawyer who's a workaholic and drinks too much, so he doesn't get home till it's past the kids' bedtime, and the wife has had to eat dinner alone, and his marriage is falling apart, and, he's a criminal prosecutor. So those are all the symptoms that we see playing out in his life in the plot. But the fatal flaw is that he's taking on the responsibility himself of trying to, save the world and be the good guy. So he's overworked. He's not sharing responsibility. He's not delegating. He's not prioritizing his personal relationships because he's so caught up in this ideal of himself as the prosecuting attorney who's going to save society from bad guys, right? Mm-hmm. So he could cut back on his work hours. He could take his wife on a vacation. He could join AA, but those would just resolve symptoms. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't resolve the character arc. What he needs to do to resolve the character arc is realize he's not solely responsible
right.
for saving the world. He's got to figure out where that issue comes from in his psyche and figure out some way to not take on that burden on himself.
Right.
And that's something we can explore. So this is the flaw and the motivation tying into theme, right? Mm-hmm. So how are we going to resolve this in his character arc? Maybe he loses a big case and is fired from work and has to start over. So by being stripped of everything he thought he valued, he has to come to a new sense of self. It could resolve in a very seemingly negative way. Right?
Right. Well, I guess that would be why stories have endpoints. You know what I mean? You can't have a series that goes on forever and ever and ever with the same character if that character is going to have a character arc, right? Because at some point you're going to have wrapped up their fatal flaw in a way that is satisfactory, and you have to move on from that character or that series.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Which would be why you have flat protagonists without arcs for series that have like 70 books with the same character.
Yeah. That is true. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We've talked about Bosch before on the show, and, he's trying to find his mother's murderer. So I'm wondering, okay, when he finds that killer and solves that case, then what? Does his emotional wound resolve because he right? Like okay, cue the happy music, or who is he going to be after he's put that to bed? Will he be any different, or what will happen?
Will it uncover a different kind of flaw or something else that is just as wounded that he didn't realize? Because again, I mean, he's very aware of that. Like, that's what he wants to do, to fix what he thinks is wrong. Right?
Right. Yeah.
So maybe there's more to it than just the fact that he needs to have that resolution, quote unquote, of knowing what happened. But that doesn't often, fix the deeper emotional, psychological problems.
Right. But it could, speaking of endpoints for stories, Kathryn, as a writer, you could say, okay, once this plot issue is resolved, then I can show the character, striding off into the sunset and leave it to the reader to imagine what's next. Well, it might not be happily ever after for this guy, but, we're done with him. The story has ended. So.
Well, he uncovered the tools to fix himself, even if it's not 100% fixed on the page, right?
Right. Well, and that kind of character with that kind of wound tied to such a specific event, if he can resolve the event, it might open some new emotional territory that he could then apply to repairing relationships. So like with that idea of the workaholic lawyer, if he was stripped of his job, maybe he could repair his marriage, but it might take a catastrophic event for him, like losing his job and his prestige and his title and his role in society, to get him to turn around and focus all that attention on his family. So that could create a nice end point to that lawyer's story, where we resolve the plot that has to do with him being a lawyer. And in the denouement, the resolution, oh, okay, now we see where he's going. He's got work ahead of him. But this is satisfying.
I think also it's good to think about bringing your baggage with you. And I like to think about these things as a dilemma, where often we will question ourselves of in what I call the sort of when then statements. So when I've got much more money, then I'll be able to have a happier family because I'll be providing for them. Or when I move to a different city, I'm going to be able to find much better friends. And the reality is that we take ourselves with us, and so the things that we're doing now that aren't working are still going to be the things that we're doing now that doing then that aren't working, whether we've got more money or live in a different city.
Right.
So I think, with someone like Bosch, you could argue that he thinks that's going to fix it. So it's, when I find my mother's murderer, then I'll be happy and I'll be resolved. Right. But he might actually get there. And this is the righteous choice, of course. He might get there and realize that it's a, what do they call that when it's a false happiness? Anyway, there's a literary term for it. See, I'm a writer. I know these things.
Right.
So if you could translate that fatal flaw into the what is the the when this happens then statement that the character will tend to carry with them, that might be a good way to help translate that, and then decide if you want to agitate, throw things at them that either aggravate that or appear to give them what they want, and it doesn't work.
Right. Right, yeah, that's a really good point. And for writers of series, that gives you a nice way to shift the problems around that fatal flaw so that you don't have to drag out, in this case, the case of the murdered mother forever, but you resolve that somewhere. Yeah, and then we see what's next for this character going forward, how he... he's happy temporarily, but then his problems resurface. New symptoms, same core wound, so he still has work to do. And it's, I know for Jess, each book has a different set of kind of relationship issues. So in book 1, she's newly divorced, so it's like, woohoo, I'm free. Yeah. She does some dating. In book 2, she's got a serious boyfriend, but it's really troubled by the plot issues. And in book 3, she's flying solo again because she's dealing with all the trauma of book 2, and the boyfriend was like, I need space, you're too much to handle. So they're different manifestations of the fatal flaw, which has a lot to do with self-confidence, standing on her own, right? And each kind of set of issues is encapsulated in each book the way the plot, the mysteries are. So think of your own evolution over time and how things change. And
next week, Robert will be back with more on the fatal flaw.
We'll examine Robert's fatal flaw.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.